My name is David Nauman. I'm a chair maker and a furniture maker in Marshalls Creek, Pennsylvania. My business is DC Nauman, Chairmaker and Cabinetmaker. And today I'd like to show you how I go about building some of the chairs. Today I'm working on what's called a sackback Windsor, which is this chair right here. And I'll show you a little bit of the process involved with it. I do it pretty much the old-fashioned way. I start with a log. We split it down into progressively smaller pieces until we get into pieces that we can work with, bend, shape, and we turn a log into a finished piece of furniture. What we start with basically is we take down a tree, or we get a tree at a sawmill. We usually shoot for a tree that has nice straight grain, tight growth rings, preferably a tree that's been in the woods for a while. You can see the end of this tree. These are nice tight rings, which means a nice fine grain. I try and look at the bark and judge the straightness of it. You can see if a tree is just growing straight, but you can also tell whether it's twisted inside by looking at the bark, and it's a judgment call. Usually it turns out pretty well, sometimes it doesn't. This particular piece, this is a piece of red oak. It was turned into a good piece for chairs. It was a little stringy, but that's fine, we can work with it. And what we've done, this is a half of the butt log. This was split in half, and then with a hammer and wedges, it's split down into farther, smaller pieces. The heartwood we split out of it. We don't use that. We'll take the bark off eventually. Now traditionally, and the way I used to do it, I would continue to split this down into pieces that would be almost the finished size. I don't quite do it that way anymore, and when we go in the shop, I'll show you how I've somewhat modernized the process without compromising the traditional method. And you'd be amazed at how far you can split this down. I've made chairs from white oak, and you can take a log that size and split it down into 16th, maybe 16th inch thick pieces and use it for actually weaving chair seats. And I can show you a chair down in the shop when we get down there that I actually did that with. And ash works well for that, white oak, hickory. But today for Windsor chairs, red oak is the wood of choice, and I also use it for rocking chairs. Same method, split it down into pieces, and then we work it down farther to finish sizes and shape it, bend it, whatever we need to do with it. These are the tools, and you use progressively finer tools the farther down you go. The first tools you work with would be a sledgehammer and wedges. Split it down into that. As we get farther down, smaller wedges. When we get down into very small pieces, these are two traditional tools that we use. It's called a froe, and this is a mallet. And this is a mallet I made myself about 20 years ago out of a piece of hickory root. It's very hard, and you can use it to pound on that metal. This is a froe, which is a traditional tool for splitting down wood into small pieces. Old timers used it for, they called it a shingle axe. And you can use it to make wooden shingles, but it's used for anything that requires splitting a large piece of wood down into small pieces, because you can control the split with it. When you're splitting pieces like this down, you always have to go in increments of half. Whatever the size of the piece of wood that you're splitting is, you always want to split it in half, because if you split it one way or the other, the split will run out and you'll lose the piece. And with this, you can lever it back and forth, and that keeps the split where you want it without it running out on you. And this is the chair. By doing all this, you can bring this tree like this down to this. And it's not that hard. So we're down the shop, and I'll show you how we go about all of it. Now we're in the shop. We split our pieces down to manageable chunks. So we go on to the next step. With the mallet and the froe, we would bring things down from a chunk like this down to small pieces like this that are actually finished size for a chair. This piece would be an arm bow for a Windsor chair. It's about a ½ inch thick and 3/4 of an inch wide. And to get it down, with the tools outside, we would bring it down larger than, as far as we can get. As I said, when you're splitting wood from a log, it always has to be halved or it'll run out. So it doesn't always end up splitting down to your finished size, and that's what we do with this. We'll take a rough piece. This is called a shaving horse, and it's all it is a vise, a foot-powered vise, and it's an old tool that's been used for centuries by traditional woodworkers. And all it does, you put a piece in it, you use a draw knife with it, and a draw knife is just a simple tool, been used for centuries for dressing down wood. Has to be very sharp, but since this wood is green, it works very easily. And you would get your rough piece clamped down with your foot, and you just shave it. And you continually shave it down until you get it down to the size you want. And then you go down to a finer tool yet, which is a spoke shave. And that'll give you a finished surface. It takes finer and finer shavings. And that's the whole secret behind all this, is going from coarser tools to finer tools. Bigger pieces to smaller pieces. And eventually you dress it down. And as I said, this is an arm bow for a Windsor chair. Now in Windsor chairs, the pieces are comprised, there's a lot of bending done with Windsor chairs. And that's what gives them their lines. But all chairs, in order to fit, to be comfortable, there are curves in them. In a ladder back chair, the backs are curved. In a Windsor chair, the backs and the arms are curved. So everything has to be bent. That's why another reason we use green wood, because it's very flexible, and red oak is a very flexible wood. But it has to be steamed. You have to get it hot, and you have to have the moisture content up to a proper level. So to do that, what we'll do, I use a steamer. And it's just very simple. All this is a turkey fryer with a piece of stovepipe on top. Fill the pot full of water and crank a gas burner up. In 10 or 15 minutes, you got a head of steam in it. Stick these in, whether it's arm bows or back bows or the back posts in a Windsor or in a ladder back chair or back splats. Put it in there for 45 minutes and you can almost tie a knot with it. But we pull it out of the steamer, we put things into forms. This would be a form for back bows for a chair like this, because you want a slight curve in those back posts. This is a form for the back splats in that ladder back chair, and there are some, you can see splats that are in it now, and they've been in there for probably a year, and they'll hold that bend for, forever. This is a Windsor chair form. And this piece here, if this was steamed, I would put it in here, wrap it around, clamp it, and then tie the ends together, and it'll hold that bend. And here's what it looks like when it comes out of the form. And this would be a back bow for a Windsor chair, for the chairs we're building today. And you can take this off. This has been sitting probably for 2 weeks, and that'll hold that curve. When I actually build the chair, I'll actually have to bring it out because it's curved past what I need. But you always want to bend them farther than they need to be bent. And a Windsor chair is basically, it's a stool with a back and arms. And that's basically what you'll have. And this whole upper assembly is held up by these spindles. And you can see how light everything is. Everything is light as a feather, but when put together as a whole, it's just amazingly a strong structure. So I'll show you some of what's involved with it. The first thing we put together is this, what we call a stool. And it's basically they call this a plank seat. It's a thick piece of pine held up by some turned legs out of maple. That's the other hallmark of a Windsor chair, is that it's built out of a variety of woods. People think a piece of furniture has to be built out of a particular species of wood, but that's not the case. Modern Windsor chairs, you'll buy them built out of solid cherry, and they advertise this as though it's some wonderful thing. It's really not. There's a reason that traditional Windsor chairs were built out of separate species of wood. The seat has to be sculpted by hand, and it would be very difficult to hand sculpt a seat out of a solid hardwood such as cherry or walnut. So traditionally, a softwood, poplar, white pine is used for the thick seat, and the reason the seat is thick is because it's made out of a soft wood. So for the strength needed, the seat has to be thick. The turnings, the legs, are generally made out of a wood that's very tight grained and good for turning on the lathe, so it takes a crisp detail. And maple fits the bill for that. Birch is sometimes used, but 99% of the time it's maple. For the upper structure, that's got to be a pliable wood. Wood you can bend, wood that's flexible, because that's what you're leaning. You're going to be sitting on it leaning. It has to be tough and flexible and light, and that can be taken down into small dimensions. And that's why it's usually oak, hickory, sometimes ash for the upper structure. So all the woods have a purpose. Modern chairs that use solid cherry for the upper structure, that's why they break a lot. And they're also not built from components that are split out of a log. That's the other thing that splitting your components, or riving it as they're traditionally termed, you have a continuous grain. Even in a piece like this, you can see how flexible that is. If you were to do that on a factory-made piece made today, you wouldn't be able to bend that at all, and when it started to bend, it would snap, simply because the grain is not continuous, and it's made out of it would be made out of cherry, which is just not a good wood for this purpose. So the first thing we do, the first component of the bench is the seat. And I'll show you how we do a little bit of sculpting on the seats. It's basically you can see it's a 2-inch thick slab of pine. When I start, it's a square block. They're roughly 17 inches deep, something like that. Each style of Windsor chair has a different type of seat. This particular style of chair is called a sack back, and the grain runs longitudinally on these chairs, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for everything in this, but there's a reason for it. The chair is longer this way than it is deep, so you always want the grain running in the longest direction. Other chairs, the continuous arm over there, the grain runs the opposite way, but it's because there's a brace in the back. It has a brace in the back. Now, we have specialized tools for scooping out these chairs. What I start with, this is called a scorp. Some chair makers use what's called an adze. It's like it's an ancient tool. Boat builders used it, but they used a gutter adze. It's almost like it looks like a grubbing hoe, but it's not. And people a lot of times will find them in a flea market or an antique store, and they'll take it home and use it for grubbing in the dirt, but it's not. It's actually a finishing tool. It's a woodworking tool. But I don't use one. I've never had one, so I don't use it. So what I do is I start with this. I start with a scorp, and it's just, now this has already been scooped out, so I'm not going to do it anymore. This is pretty much a finished surface, but you just go from the sides in, and that's how you get that nice hollow. That's what makes the seat comfortable. Usually I shoot for about 7/8 deep to hollow that out, and a nice saddle here. After the scorp, we have other finishing tools over here. This is called a travisher. This will leave a lot of facets, a lot of tool marks in it. This will take them out. Again, you go from a coarse tool to a finer tool. We'll take this will take a finer cut because I can adjust it. This will smooth it down for a final surface. I'll take it down with a curved scraper, and then before we finish it, I'll probably go over it with a little sandpaper. Since it is a thick plank, and Windsor chairs are meant to be a light chair, and they want them to look light. So you don't want to see those nice graceful legs jutting out from underneath a big old thick slab of pine. So what we want to do is dress the edge so that from above, as you're looking down on the chair, that the seat looks thin and it looks delicate and graceful. So what we go for is a quarter round around the back. So we'll put this in the vise. Now I've already got this roughed in with a draw knife. But again, you go from coarse tool to fine tool. Let me get a spoke shave. This is the next tool in line that we'll use. And you can see the tool marks, the facets left by the draw knife, because the draw knife, you could take it a little farther with that, but that's as far as I generally go with it. And then we'll take the spoke shave, and you always have to be aware of which way the grain's going, because since this is on a curve, this is the midpoint. So past this midpoint, you can't pull towards you because you'll be digging into the grain. You always have to go downhill on the grain. You can see where the way the grain is running downhill. So you stay on this side of the midpoint. Kind of cock the blade. You start to get into end grain. The thing with hand tools, they have to be sharp. A lot of people get frustrated when they use hand tools, and most of the problems they have with them relate to sharpness. If the tool is not sharp, they'll torture you. Now you can see the problem when you start. This is the end grain. You can see the problem, especially with pine. You end up with a rough surface with a cutting tool, because cutting tools tend not to work well on end grain. But what I'll do, that's when we go to a rasp, and that solves that problem. Again, you want to always be working in the direction of the grain. And you could use sandpaper, but